Hello everyone. On behalf of the Continence Foundation of Australia, I'd like to welcome you to today's very special Carers webinar. And we're looking at the role for carers and how you go about managing incontinence in somebody that you love and have care for. I would first like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional owners on the land on which we meet today. I'd also like to pay my respects to the elders, both past and present, of all of Australia's Indigenous peoples. Well, thank you for joining us today. We have selected an expert panel to help address some of the questions that you may have around your role as a carer and around some of the practical elements of caring for a loved one who may suffer from either fecal, urinary or both types of incontinence. So our panel members today are Mandy Taylor. Mandy, welcome.
Thank you.
Mandy is a clinical psychologist. Thanks for joining us, Mandy. I'd also like to welcome Rose Goonan. Rose is an occupational therapist. Hi, Rose.
Hi, Bronwyn.
Thanks for joining us. And last but not least, is Meryl McPhee, and Meryl is a continence nurse advisor, and she is one of our employees at the National Continence Foundation in a role on our National Continence Helpline. So we're delighted to welcome you, Meryl.
Good afternoon. Thanks, Bron.
Now, what does it mean to be a carer? So we have a carer's story that we would like to share with you. And this carer actually was awarded the Carer of the Year award back in 2017. Family meant everything to Anna. Every week they gathered around Anna's dining table in the home she and her husband Philip shared with her mother Dina in Reservoir in Melbourne South. Known as a wonderful cook, Anna followed the culinary traditions handed down to her by her then 90-year-old mother, who'd moved to Australia from northern Italy in the 1950s. During her working life, Anna worked with intellectually disabled adults as a carer and a house supervisor at a Department of Human Services facility for intellectually disabled adults. She always looked out for other people. It's always part of her nature to be caring and encouraging to others. She loved helping the residents, especially when she could take them out on field trips and provide them support and care so that they could enjoy some independence and some dignity, said Anna's daughter, Sonia. For more than 25 years, Anna provided care to her intellectually disabled clients, and while many would head home for rest when they clocked off at the end of the day, Anna would clock on for her labour of love. For all her life, Anna had lived with her mother, Dina. When Anna married Philip in 1972, the newlyweds lived at home with Anna's parents until they could afford to go out on their own. But suddenly, in 1974, Anna's father, Ampelio, died. The intergenerational living arrangements, initially intended to help the newlyweds, continued. Anna's family soon grew with the addition of daughters Maria Louise, Sonia and Dina. 12 years ago, Dina was diagnosed with dementia. Anna, Philip and their girls all pulled together to provide care for Dina as dementia worked its way through its various debilitating stages, and more recently, a diagnosis of Parkinson's disease continued to provide more obstacles. Naturally, it was Anna who took on the bulk of the burden, adapted her lifestyle to meet the crippling effects of her mother's condition. Anna became Dina's full-time carer, catering to meet the high care needs her mother reached in her later years. Dina was totally dependent on Anna for everything. She could no longer walk, had limited language skills, needed help with feeding, required assistance going to the toilet, and was incontinent. Sonia described her mum's relationship with Dina as very special. Caring for someone is very hard, but caring for your mother and being powerless to stop the ravages of her condition as your roles reverse was incredibly hard for Mum. But you'd never have known. She had never been anything but positive, supportive and nurturing, making sure all our needs were met with dignity and love. Dina passed away 2 years ago. So I guess as a personal story, lots of Anna's experiences would resonate for many of you joining us today. I wanted to start with you, Mandy, and just talk about the difficulties that carers find, particularly when there's that reversal in roles from being the child to then taking over the caring of a mother, and particularly when we're talking about incontinence, which is such a personal type of condition.
So, Rose, it's a pretty confronting time, isn't it? And I guess I'm thinking certainly the families that I've worked with, they often talk about their experiences and reactions across a few different planes, if you like. So certainly there's, the grief of the impact of the illness or condition on your loved one and the impact on what that might be doing to your loved one's personality and their own coping. But there's also elements around, I guess, transition of yourself. Certainly when you talk about, Anna and her experiences, when she moved into the caring role again, there was a sense of needing to devote a lot of time, change a lifestyle, and how that impacts the carer at the same time that they're actually managing the grief of what's happening to their loved one. That complexity is really, really tough. So certainly what we see and what's absolutely natural and normal at that point of transition or a point where people are actually feeling, burdened by care is a sense of exhaustion, sometimes frustration and anger, and people can have a lot of guilt around that. So there's a sense when people are managing so many different things that are very practical and very physical, and like you said, when we're talking about continence, quite confronting, and then they're actually trying to emotionally care for and connect with their loved one as well. One of the things that we certainly talk about is that loss of self in the process. We strongly recommend that people find somebody to talk to. Sometimes it's, someone like the Continence Foundation or a similar caring group. The other thing that I find really, really helpful to talk to, and Meryl and Rose, this might kind of go into your territory a little bit, but finding people that can give you really practical advice around how you're managing behaviour and the practicalities of caring for somebody as well. Now, have I lost my train of thought? Because I tend to.
No, you did perfectly well, Mandy. Thank you. Meryl, have you got something to add to that?
Definitely. I agree with what Mandy said. We see that even with continence assessment, and I think that it's extremely important that people get the best support that they can. Speaking to one of the nurses at the National Continence Helpline certainly would be helpful. There's lots of tips and tricks and product advice and daily living information that can be possible, guiding people through how to do some of the caring, then the financial assistance that can come, because that becomes a bit of a burden too. And I think with carers, it's very difficult sometimes when they go from being a daughter to a mother or father and all of a sudden they're in a carer's role, that the dynamics change quite considerably. And for some of them, it's very difficult because the parent still thinks of them as being a child, despite the fact that they might be 40, 50 or 60 years of age. And all of a sudden their child is telling them what to do or explaining what to do. And so that can become quite confronting sometimes. So learning how to manage and direct and support people is quite interesting.
So we've had quite a few questions around this, and I might go back to you, Mandy, because some of it is around, I guess, do we need to actually have the conversation with the loved one whose care we're taking over and explain why we're asking to be involved with some of those intimate activities such as toileting. I'm wondering how to help prepare both sides of the relationship.
That's a great question, Bronwyn. Certainly what's worked successfully for families in the past is stepping it through in a transition way. So rather than a dramatic change in a relationship that the loved one isn't expecting and comes out of the blue, certainly those early discussions of, I can see that there might be some things that are difficult for you at the moment. I can see that there's a lot of things that you're doing really well. So really balancing that sense of, when I see that you're struggling with a challenge, I wonder if I can help, but keeping in mind that we're also celebrating the strengths and what the person can do. So, in my work, I certainly support carers, but I also support people who are impacted by or something similar. And that sense of how do you maintain your self-esteem and your identity and your independence is so important. So when a carer is approaching the discussion, planning language is really helpful. It's not scary. It's not out of the blue. It's not a surprise. Surprise parties at different points in life are exciting. Surprise parties around this are not exciting. So really letting a person warm up and begin to process what's happening and why you might be suggesting that.
I was just going to pick up on that. What if the relationship is one of a husband and wife and one of the partners is now in a position of dependency? So one of the questions that we had, which I thought was a very powerful one, is how do you balance the intimacy of that relationship then with the role of the carer? I'll open that up. I don't mind who starts on that one. Perhaps you, Meryl.
Okay, it does become quite confronting. It is difficult to separate and manage that. Certainly, we always rely on the support of other people to have that caring role, and sometimes it does mean having a carer come in to do some of the more intimate things, especially when it's bowel related. But getting into a good routine, maintaining that level of independence, so that allowing the person to still do some of the tasks for themselves with some guidance, so that you've got the support of the carer and the person who needs the caring, that they still have that support until they get to a point where they can't do it any longer, and then the carer needs to look at possibly having a carers come in to actually support some of the daily living, including showering and those sorts of things. Because you want to be able to maintain that relationship if you can. And one of the things that does get lost is that individuality and having that close relationship, and where it goes from carer from husband or wife relationship to a carer's role can be quite confronting for a lot of people.
I do have a little bit to add, and I think, the grief around watching a loved one deteriorate or really struggle with some physical challenges is really, really tough. Certainly some of the things that we talk about is actually creating and protecting a space where the relationship is celebrated. So, when we're managing continence or managing quite significant physical challenges, it becomes all consuming. And then we get tired and we lose a sense of loving touch rather than practical touch. We might lose a sense of how we celebrate our connection, whatever that might be now, because it might have evolved and the memories of where that relationship were might be different. But think about how you connect at, I guess, an emotional level and a physical level. We often talk about little things like, if you're watching a TV show that you both enjoy, a hand massage. So something that's a physical touch with a loved one that's nothing to do with continence, nothing challenging, nothing intrusive, but just I'm here and I love you. Because like I said earlier, we often feel really exhausted with the practicalities of caring. And how do we actually just really enjoy the person that we love? It might be things like, going through photo albums or collections of photos, or telling stories about the types of things that you've done together, or thinking about, it's interesting, isn't it, the skills that we've picked up in isolation in terms of accessing things remotely. access a remote art gallery if that was your thing. So think about where your joy is at and how you can tap into that.
Thank you. Rose, can I bring you in here from the practical, from your occupational therapy perspective, around ways in which we can set up the environment in which we're living and caring to ensure that those relationship boundaries can be crossed relatively easily, but also where appropriate, if we're talking about a spousal or couple relationship, that intimacy can be maintained?
Sure. I think, as both Meryl and Mandy have highlighted, it's extremely important to reach out for help in terms of getting additional supports and services in the home to help manage things like showering or bowel actions if they're happening at a regular time. Just really reaching out for help. I think a good thing to do too would be to look at getting someone like an occupational therapist into the home to complete an assessment of someone's current functional abilities and ways that you can enable independence. There's lots of different strategies that can be looked at that can increase someone's independence and make them feel more like they can manage certain things on their own and not constantly requiring the assistance of their partner. So, I mean, there are a number of different strategies and they would be all as specific to the individual as anything else. So
lovely. Okay, thanks, Rose. Bringing it down to another key point is that maintenance of dignity in the person that you love. And we've actually got a lot of questions around this. So I'm kind of going to work through them because they each hit on something a little bit different. So the first one is where a daughter enters mum's home and the first thing that hits her is the smell of urine. She's tried to raise it with her mother, but her mother refuses to admit that she has a problem. Meryl, you might want to take this one first.
All right. So one of the things that we often look at is odour, and people do become a little bit familiar with their own odour. So there are some good products that are available to minimise that. They can be quite discreet. There's a product called Hoscon, which comes as a gel. You can take the lid off, put it in a discreet place under the bed head if it's in the bedroom, in the corner behind the toilet, and it just helps absorb some of the odour. It lasts about 2 years. You can reconstitute it by putting in the sunshine, and it's not one of those things that grabs. There's no scent to it. It just absorbs some of the odour. Things like there are some sprays. Hoscon have a spray as well, but it's not like a room spray where you've got that cloying scent. It's almost undiscernible, and you can spray it onto clothing as well. There's a product called Febreze too that you can get just at your local supermarket that could be sprayed on cloth and fabric, and just airing the linen and making sure that they have fresh linen as appropriate, and products. Now, sometimes with dementia, they don't want to be looking at, if they're in denial, they don't want to be seeing something obvious like a bed pad on top of a sheet. So having good mattress protection underneath the sheet might be one way of dealing with that issue. And then wearing an appropriate product. So sometimes I know when I've done continence assessments and gone to a home, I actually had a lady come and say that I was talking with her husband about management and products, and she said, "I'll fix you," and she ran out of the room, and she came running back into the room with a packet of continence products and said, "My daughter bought this for me. There's nothing wrong with me, and they're disgusting," and she threw it across the room at me. So she didn't like the idea of a disposable product, so we discussed the possibility of washable products, and it did mean that they actually had to remove the underwear that she was used to wearing and replace it with continence products. And that was one step where, because it was fabric, it was a little bit more like what she was used to wearing, and so it was less confronting. And then as things progressed, we were able to introduce disposable products at a point where it made it, there was, to make it easier for the husband. But you have to do things by degree, and you've got to be very aware that they're an individual, and you've got to remember that they've still got that sense of dignity, even if mentally they're not managing or discussing or looking after their own ways of looking at things. So we do have to be careful how we present management to them too.
Just to highlight that there's a host of really great products available. There are things like waterproof doona covers and waterproof fitted sheets that can be wiped down and don't require the regular washing. There's floor pads, chair pads, lots of things that can be easily picked up and washed. So if there are certain areas in the home where the odour is stronger or more distinct, you could try and work out, so if it's a lounge chair or in the bedroom, what product might be best available that can sort of be easily removed and washed rather than, for example, urine getting on the carpet or on the mattress.
Thanks, Rose.
There are lots of products that are available, and it's
Meryl,
definitely worthwhile investigating.
Thank you. Meryl, where should people look for them? The pharmacy, supermarket, or do they need to go to a special supplier? And also, can you spell the name of that absorbing product?
Okay. Hosgon, it's Hosgon. It comes as a gel or a spray. It's available through the national companies. So they're Independence Australia, Bright Sky, In Touch, and Victoria Healthcare Products. They're all national suppliers. They're available online, or there are contact phone numbers where you can ring and organise that. Not all chemists would stock that product, but a lot of chemists are quite happy to research and supply product to people if they've got a good relationship with them. The helpline has a list of those things, so if they rang the helpline, we could give them that information. Then Febreze, Febreze, is a fabric spray that's available in supermarkets, which is readily available, quite inexpensive, and works very well. And that's something that can be discreet, that they're not aware of. And as Mandy was saying, there are so many different products to help and assist insofar as non-step formats and bedding, and they're all available at those national services as well. I mean, there are still some available through places like IKEA or the chemist store, Spotlight, those sort of things. They might be more readily accessible, but a lot of the products don't last quite as long maybe as the ones from the national services.
Okay, thanks, Meryl. The next question, I think, is probably split between Mandy and Rose. So this person has a dad who wears pads, but he also has trouble changing them. Now, when he's having that difficulty, he becomes confused, he becomes anxious, but he does leak, so he needs them. So there's the question finishes with a very large help exclamation mark.
So I think from an occupational therapy point of view, and what we tend to look at, particularly in the hospital environment, is experimenting with different sorts of pads to see if there are some that are easier to manage than others. As Meryl has said, there's a wide variety. There's pull-ups that more replicate normal underwear. There's reusable products. There's slip pads. It might be that he can manage certain pads more easily than others. The other thing is to consider things like clothing that he is wearing. So things like avoiding buttons and zippers and looking at elasticized waists, or replacing zippers with Velcro to make them easier to manage. I guess particularly with urgency, people, it becomes far more difficult to manage things like buttons and zips than elasticized waists.
Okay, thanks, Rose. That makes sense. Mandy, is your puppy settled?
How did you know that was my puppy?
Yeah,
sorry.
That's all right.
He's very excited to be part of this webinar. He just wants to join in. I guess the only thing I'd add to what Rose was saying was, in terms of introducing, I guess, new slippers and new clothes and Velcro and things like that, is just be really, really careful about your language, that it's, it's a celebration of making life easier and the practicalities easier. So when we've got energy, we can actually focus on the things that we enjoy. It's not a sign of anything negative. It's certainly not punitive, but we really need to make sure that it's a focus on the positive when we're introducing something new. And I really liked Meryl's story about the cloth underwear rather than the pads for that particular person, when she, that for her was a sign of dignity. It might have been tactile as well. So I really like the concept of not just having the practical products, but introducing them in a really positive way.
And I guess it is a way to enable independence rather than try to take that independence away from them. So reframing it in that sense.
I just want to bring the conversation back to the person who has the role as the carer. So again, speaking from personal experience, my dear old mum tried to live at home after my father passed, managed to have a bad fall, ended up coming and living with me without support of the only other sibling. It is exhausting. You do your very best. At that stage, I had teenage children, a husband who worked. I was trying to forge a career, and it took its toll. So what are some of the suggestions, Mandy, around the supports available to help get carers through? I know from my own, it was a social worker who ended up saying, "You can't keep doing this, Bronwyn," which was incredibly confronting, and then made me question the quality of care. So, how can we assist carers who might be grappling with that issue?
And this is a question, Bronwyn, that I'm happy to share with Meryl and Rose as well.
Thank you.
From an emotional perspective, something that was in your story that's really common is that sense of an external person, a social worker, often at a hospital. If you've had an event and you've ended up in hospital, where they say, actually, you need to draw a line in the sand. Enough is enough, and you've tried for as long as you can, and you're not actually managing. And usually that's physically managing in terms of being able to support somebody, in and out of the home, in and out of beds, toileting, showering, what have you, with or without a degree of external care. So certainly at that point of transition, we often find that having an external voice there is really helpful, and an external caring expert voice. So hearing it often from a sibling or a friend is very, very different to hearing it from a health professional. And that's one of the reasons we strongly encourage people to consult, to ring a helpline or come somewhere like the Continence Foundation and ask an expert, this is what's going on. What else can I add, or what are you thinking of that I haven't thought of? Because when we step it through as a carer, sorry, that's my puppy again. We've just decided to have workmen in the street, which is perfect timing. I'll mute myself in a second. So that sense of knowing that there are people that you can ask opinions of, not just for practical help, but I'm doing this. Is this the best way? Are there other things that I can think of? I might hand over to Meryl and just mute myself for a second.
Meryl, can I get you to pick up on Mandy's point?
Certainly. So there are different ways of looking at getting management and support. There are referrals through your GP and or My Aged Care to a continence service if you are aware that there are continence issues, so that you can look at the best products and management in that regard. And then if you're needing support as a carer, there are different levels of home care packages that are available as well. And you need a referral for an ACAT or an ACAS assessment. They're teams of medical, nursing, allied health staff like Mandy and Rose to support you at home. And there's also financial assistance as well. So you can pay for a carer to come in, someone to shower your parent, so that it's taking that one level away, so that you've got a bit more privacy, that someone else is doing the showering and the washing, and you're looking after the other daily activities. Also looking at having meals prepared for them. So you're taking some of the pressure off yourself as a carer, and it doesn't decrease the level of dignity or your caring role, but it supports you so that you can maintain that 24 hours, because it is a 24-hour manage and support that you're doing at home, and having that external support certainly makes a difference. But you do need to go through that, get a referral through My Aged Care. It does take about 45 to 75 minutes to organise an assessment. They ask lots of questions, so be prepared for a lot of questions, but they're trying to tease out the best way of getting the support that you need and the appropriate services to give you that support.
I think, Meryl, one of the things that you've raised there is for the carer to actually reach that point where they go, I need help. And I guess that's the part that I think is challenging, because as the carer of someone you love, you naturally think, I am the best placed. It should be me providing the care. So how do we shift that dialogue for the carer to actually say, I think I need to ask the question? What gets the carer to that point? We don't want it to be when they've absolutely fallen over the line. So is there a little mental checklist that...
It's a very difficult thing to address often, I find. And often it's not until there's been a major incident like a fall, or all of a sudden there's incontinence where there wasn't previously, that they have a good relationship with a GP, so that they can say, this is happening, I'm not sure what to do, where do I go? Certainly we had a lot of calls to the helpline from people who've spoken to a friend who've said, there's a service that you can ring, they can give you support, they can give you guidance as to who you might need to be referred to and the sorts of services that are available. So whether it's OT or psychologist or other allied health, to give that support and having an assessment so that you can be supported in the best way possible.
Lovely, thank you. Mandy, did you have anything else to add?
I don't think so. I think Meryl answered it beautifully.
Wonderful.
I do think that concept of checking in with other people is really important, because certainly what we find with people in a caring position, as you said, Bronwyn, you really don't want to acknowledge that there might be things that you can't do for your loved one. That's such a tough space to sit in. And sometimes having another opinion or another voice in that space is really helpful. And if it's a voice with expert understanding, it's much easier to hear.
I think one of the ways we discuss this in the hospital setting too, with an aged care assessment, is it doesn't even need to be something that needs to be acted on immediately. It is something that can be kept in the back pocket, so to speak, until crisis hits. And that help needs to be drawn on sort of in quite a quick period of time. The ACAS assessments can take a while to be completed, and home care packages can have wait lists. So to be pre-prepared for a worsening of function in the future, it's a very proactive thing, even if they're not ready to seek help right at that stage.
Now, I agree with Rose. Sometimes people will wait so long that when they really do need the support,
That's right.
the time frame for receiving the support is way and beyond what you would expect. So being aware of what might be available so that you can work on that, start the process going so that even if they don't need it immediately, the steps are in place so that you can say, well, this is happening now, we need to go further, we need to get the support that we've been discussing, 12 months ago. You need to get the process in place rather than waiting till the last minute and then finding that, it might be even 6 or 12 months before you can get in for an assessment. You need to be thinking about it before that. And unfortunately, you do need to be thinking about it before it becomes a major issue and you're so exhausted that you're not coping, and you want to be able to support and cope, but you also need to look after yourself. And if you can't look after yourself, you're not going to be able to look after for your loved one.
Yeah.
Thank you. I want to move on to some of the more practical elements around managing incontinence in your role as a carer. And the first one, again, it's incredible how many different variations of this question we're getting through. So this is about fluid intake. It's about difficulty getting a parent to drink sufficient fluid. It's about having only limited access to continence pad stocks, therefore making the decision to limit the number of drinks you're giving your mother so that she's not constantly wetting herself, and then what fluids we should or should not be giving to those people we're caring for.
Okay, I'll start. So generally on a daily basis, we suggest that you have 6 to 8 drinks in a day, which is around 1.5 to 2 litres of a variety of fluids. So it can be tea, coffee, water, juice, a combination of all of those things. You do have to be a little bit careful with the caffeine in tea and coffee because they can be a bladder irritant. But what we also need to think about is that concentrated urine is actually a bladder irritant. So if they're not drinking adequately, then that concentrated urine irritates the bladder, gives them more urgency. The odour is much stronger because it's a darker colour, and so then that becomes cloying and it's more obvious, whereas if the urine is dilute and you're drinking adequately, it should be pale. And then separately to that, there should be less odour associated because it's not in a concentrated form. So the drinking is important, but you can still have ice cream and custards and those sorts of things to give you fluid. There's plenty of fluid in, fruit and vegetables. So it's looking at a whole range of different things, maybe even speaking to a dietitian if they're not eating or drinking all that much, so that you get a balanced diet as well. So you're looking at all of those things.
What about limiting the amount of drink to ensure we don't use too many continence products?
Well, you shouldn't be limiting your fluids. You should be drinking to thirst. And obviously when it's cooler, you tend to drink a little bit less. When it's hotter, you tend to drink a little bit more. It also depends too, I suppose, if there are other underlying medical conditions and you're on a fluid restriction. But drinking is important because if you become constipated, that can make the bladder more overactive. If you're not drinking enough, the stool becomes drier, and then that becomes part of the issue as well. So it's managing everything in a practical way so that we've organised with, eating well and drinking well and having good healthy habits that we've had for a long time.
If there's a reluctance to sort of be using pads because they're quite costly, the other thing to consider would be the Continence AIDS payment scheme, so that there is government funding available to help pay for AIDS, if that is one of the concerns, and that's why you're trying to limit fluids.
That's great.
Thank you, so Rose. There's a Continence AIDS payment scheme with this Commonwealth government funding. In some of the states, there are also state funding. So finding out about those and getting a referral for an assessment so that you can work out the most cost-efficient products for you. There are thousands of products that aren't necessarily available easily at a supermarket or chemist. There are through the national companies, you can get samples so that you can try something before you go ahead and buy a packet, because there's nothing worse than buying a packet and then finding it's the wrong size or the wrong shape, or your loved one hates what it is or it doesn't fit properly. If you're going to have a product, it needs to be something that they are happy with, that they're comfortable with, that they're happy to wear. Because if they're not happy wearing it, you're going to have reluctance with that as well. So that's another aspect. And finding out about the funding, you can always ring the helpline for that. Speaking with your occupational therapist or a psychologist, any of the health professionals should be aware that there is support available and the best way to access that support. So the funding is, the CAPS funding, there are eligible conditions. Just because you happen to be incontinent may not necessarily mean that the funding's available, and you do need to have a continence assessment to work out the best products and have a management plan in place. So that's probably the most important thing to think about.
Thank you. Anyone else have anything to add to that? Terrific. Well, moving on now, we're looking at using incontinence products for developing rashes. And again, quite a few that have started where people have tried to buy creams, which are helping a little but not sufficient, where they're using incontinence products designed specifically for urinary incontinence, and now finding that their partner is defecating in them as well. So a couple of things there. So if we can tackle the rashes first and then look at the sorts of product differences for urinary and fecal incontinence. Who would like to take that one?
Okay. There are many products available, and probably the easiest thing is just avoiding soap and water. So unless it's a goat milk soap, because a lot of soaps are acidic, so they irritate the skin. When people are incontinent, they tend to be wanting to wash more, so then they're rubbing the skin. And in older people, the skin becomes more fragile, so the more rubbing you do, the more difficult it can become. There are many different products for skin care, so you do need to change products regularly. You do need to try different products as well. Some products are a little bit more irritative to the skin. Some people are just more sensitive than others. So it's finding a product that you're comfortable with and that's good for you. I won't give any names here because there's just too many to list. There are lots of good skincare products too, but you do have to be careful with those. I mean, there are lots of zinc-based ones. People tend to think, like they do with babies, that if you slather it on thickly, that it'll be really efficient and effective, but you create a huge barrier on the skin, which you then have to scrub off. It also can make the continence products waterproof, so that then they don't function as efficiently, because the layer of skincare that you've put on the skin becomes a barrier on the product, and then it runs off the side and isn't absorbed into the product, and then they think that the product isn't working well, but it's because of the skincare range that they've used. So there are many different types. You can get samples of those as well. They come as washes. They come as skin protection. There's different layers of barriers according to what's appropriate, and also to just making sure that if there is a rash, you speak to your GP and get the rash checked to make sure that there's no underlying infection there and that you're not feeding it by putting all these layers and layers of product on top of the surface. Then with products, most products are available for urinary incontinence. Less products are available for fecal incontinence. There is a product there are special insert pads that you can put inside pull-up underwear and other products, so that when they become soiled, you can actually take those out. You've still got the protection of the pull-up variety to absorb the urine, but then the fecal incontinence is removed. And then looking at timed toileting, so that you try and prevent a fecal or a bowel-related accident from happening. So, sitting your loved one on the toilet 20 to 30 minutes after a meal, going with what's called the gastrocolic reflex, which stimulates the gut, so that if they're in the right place at the right time, they're less likely to have an accident. Keeping a bit of a diary to see when the accident occurs, so that you can actually, if it seems to be around a similar time of day, that you actually have them in the bathroom, on the toilet around that particular time, so that at least they evacuate, so that it's one less episode that you have to be managing and dealing with.
Thank you. I'd actually like to just touch on a question that we've had through from David. And David, thank you very much for sharing your story. David's looking after his 62-year-old wife who has late-stage Alzheimer's. She's almost non-verbal, and she has both bladder and bowel incontinence. He's using the double up products with disposable pants during the day and overnight. He's just actually wondering whether they're okay to use the double up products all the time.
That should be fine. Double ups are very good, definitely. And I've had a lot of patients who have used the double up product. Yeah, it's definitely used as an insert pad, and it's a good way of managing.
Thank you. Okay. I want to talk about trying to get out and about with a loved one who may have incontinence. Perhaps, Mandy, firstly, you could discuss the importance of maintaining those social connections outside of the home. And then if I can ask Rose and Meryl to pick up on the practical sides of what you need to be doing so that you can actually take the person you're caring for out and about, but also manage the incontinence at the same time.
Thanks, Bronwyn. Well, if I start, you might have answered the question yourself. The social connections are so important. When we think about the impact of caring for a loved one, often what people talk about again is that sense of isolation and aloneness. What we know in terms of happiness and well-being is that the more connected people are, and that doesn't have to be connected to lots of people, it means a few quality connections or regular connections, then the more resilient they are in terms of their emotional well-being, the more positive they can be. If you can find a space where you can really protect and nurture your social connections, and if you can find a space to do that that actually nurtures, other aspects of yourself, if it's an exercise aspect or walking through nature, if you can have breaks and go walking with a friend, and I get in trouble for my sense of humour, but I often talk about hugging a tree or kind of celebrating a star. It doesn't have to be big moments. It doesn't have to be lots of moments away. There's small moments where you actually take a moment to breathe and notice that you're doing something for yourself and you're connecting with another person. There's a story that we often use in training about somebody who was going through quite a significant family event and was talking to their psychologist about what did they do to look after themselves or recharge. And he said, I love going fishing. I like to, walk down to the pier and just throw a line in. I don't have to catch anything. I just like sitting there and watching the ripples over the water, and that's how I recharge. That's my space. And then the psychologist said, and when did you do that last? And he said, 7 years ago, I think, it was 7. So it's that sense of actually being really conscious of where can you fit in time for yourself and scheduling it, because that's so important. It's a priority.
I think just really considering the practical aspects of the trip. So planning in advance, as Meryl says, thinking about keeping a bladder or a bowel journal so you can get a really clear sense of times when people are sort of likely to need to open their bowels or bladder and avoid travelling in those times. And thinking about what to take on the trip. So you might consider taking a change of clothes, plastic bags, wet wipes, spare pads. Sometimes people use, you could take a container in the car with you if it's a male to urinate into during the trip, if that's required, if it's an urgent situation. There's also something that's called the National Public Toilet Map. I'm not sure people have heard of that, but that's an Australian government thing where you can actually plan your journey and it maps out all the public toilets that are available on the way. So if there is an urgent situation and you need to know where a toilet is quite quickly, you can see wherever you are and find the closest public toilet.
The other thing I can add to what Rose has just said is that there is something that began in New South Wales called an MLAC key. It's MLAK, and it's a Master Locksmiths Association key. And if you go to a Master Locksmith and it's not a Mr. Minute that you need to go to, there is a form that you can download off the internet and have your GP fill it in, giving medical support. You can obtain this key from the Master Locksmith, and it can give you access to some of the public facilities, so that if you're caught and the toilet is locked, then you can actually use the key to access that toilet, and it does make it a little bit easier for people.
The good thing about the toilet map too is that people write reviews, And I know we see reviews for movies and TV shows and all sorts of other things, but this is actually a really important review. So it talks often about the cleanliness, whether there's soap, water, plenty of toilet paper, easy access for wheelchair access, whether it was set up for mother and children toileting opportunities. So all of those things are available. You can find more information about the National Toilet Map from the Continence Foundation website. So I suggest having a look there, and you'll find the links, and that will be able to give you some more information. Thank you. We've actually got another question from one of our viewers, Brian. Thanks, Brian, again for sharing your story. And I know these are hard stories to share. Brian's actually started looking after an old mate of his who has developed continence issues. So his friend's been waiting for a cystoscopy to open up his prostate. In the meantime, Brian is providing care. He asks two particular questions. One, are there any fundamental differences in looking after an older man? And secondly, are there any fundamental differences in the approach or technique, particularly from a perspective of being a male carer? And thank you, Mandy, for your gorgeous little pups joining us, which is just a lovely, brings a smile to everyone's face. Thank you.
Sorry, he's barking. I'm trying to soothe the vicious beast.
We are all, everyone is welcome here, including those with four legs as well as two. The differences in approach and technique for a male carer, and the differences in looking after an older man.
There's some very good products that are available, and I think if his friend is experiencing some incontinence, then speak to the GP and get a referral to a continence service, because the nurses will be able to organise the best products that he can use in the most efficient way, so that he can enable his friend to change. There are male products, a bit like a box, shaped like a box, that can go inside the underwear. There's washable underwear as well that might make it a little bit easier. There's a range of different products and samples. There are some, as Rose was saying, with Velcro to make it easier to access, and clothing is important as well. So you're still wanting to maintain that level of dignity, because it is a little bit difficult if as a friend, but a lot of friends do look after friends in that regard too. So seeking the best advice possible so that it makes it easier to maintain that friendship and relationship without and the dignity of his friend as well. So enabling his friend and finding out about the appropriate products for him are going to make life much easier for them both.
Thanks, Meryl. We've got time for one more question. And this one just rings so many bells, and I'm sure it will for all of you out there viewing today, that you're caring for a loved one and you're starting to do a lot more heavy lifting. And guess what? You're starting to leak as well. So let's look at this issue from our multiple perspectives, starting with you, Mandy, around care for the carer.
I think, again, one of the really, really common things with carers is we get so busy focusing on our loved ones and managing all the different aspects that managing somebody with high needs involves, that we often forget our own health. And that might be something as simple as our regular checkups, our regular blood tests, our regular medication. But of course, with every day passing, we're getting older. There's different demands on our body as well. So I'll leave the practical questions to Meryl and Rose, but I would like to talk a little bit about the importance of self-care. And I'm a psychologist. I'm biased. I do emphasise the importance of emotional self-care. But in that well-being, there's also staying active. And we often get so tired lifting and pulling and cleaning and doing all of the things required at home, we forget that walking and different types of activity keep us cardio fit, keep our muscles fit in a different way. And if we can, it's really, really important to look after our physical selves as well as our emotional health in that space. I'll hand over for a more practical response from Rose or Meryl.
I can contribute here just to consider a physiotherapy or an occupational therapy assessment to look at ways you can actually avoid doing that heavy lifting through things like equipment or home modifications. So, you know, equipment like over toilet frames or rails or toilet seat raisers, just really sort of practical things that can sort of reduce the how heavy things are, and also looking at you know, mobility aids and things like that. So requesting through My Aged Care physiotherapy or an occupational therapy assessment to come into the home and have a look at, you know, practical ways you can avoid that.
Thank you.
Um, what I have missed out during all of this is the need for looking at pelvic muscle function. And so it's really important to look after your pelvic floor, to do your pelvic muscle exercises so that you've got that increased muscle control, so that it does prevent you from having the leakage. And they are simple to do. It's not a floor exercise where you lie on the floor. It's actually an exercise, a muscle exercise. And so with aging, it does become a bit thinner. Your ability to hold on becomes a little bit less, and seeking advice about that so that when you're doing your lifting, you're actually engaging your pelvic floor as well, so that there's less risk of you developing incontinence too. There are lots of continence services that can support you as a carer. And as Rose said, you know, looking after yourself, getting a referral to a continence, to a physio, or OT to look at how you actually lift and manage in that caring role is really important. And they're just simple things to do. People think that, you know, often they take a lot of time, whereas they can take a very small amount of time, and it's for your benefit and for your loved one's benefit too. Because if you, as I said before, if you don't look after yourself, you're not going to be in a position to be able to look after them properly either. And then that becomes quite difficult too.
Thank you. Well, I can't believe that 1 hour has flown by so quickly. I hope all of you joining us today have found the information of value. I would like to thank our 3 presenters, to Meryl McVie, to Rose Goonan, and to Mandy Taylor. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise today. And a reminder to all of you that if you do have a question specifically around incontinence, that we have the National Continence Helpline. It's open from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m, Monday to Friday. It's a free call number, 1-800-33-0066. It is manned by continence nurse advisors, just like Meryl. You might even get Meryl answering your question. And if they're unable to help, they will also be able to refer you. I'd also like to remind people of the work done by the Ken Miller Institute, which is where Mandy works. So particularly for people who are carers and are grappling with the issues associated with that, they have a free telehealth service as well, and their number is 1-800-391393. And I'd like to thank all of you for joining us. Good luck on your journeys. It's not an easy road, but it's one that is done with love, and I congratulate you all. Thanks for joining us. Goodbye.